Welcome, everyone, to our brand new podcast called Getting Deep with a PhD and a JD.
Hey,
Hey, Kimmy.
how are you?
I'm good. Hey, I have a really important question for you. Actually, it's really not a question. It's a situation that I want to describe to you, and then I want you to tell me what you think I'm describing.
Okay.
So I want you to imagine a situation where you are forced to work from sunup to sundown. You are forced to pick cotton. You're forced to pick vegetables. To take care of livestock. You are not paid. You're forced to live in dilapidated housing. You are forced to eat substandard food if you receive any food at all.
Mm.
And you are whipped. And if you don't pick a certain amount of product, you are whipped as well. And if you do anything to step out of line, you're whipped. And if you don't show the proper respect, you're whipped. So what am I describing?
Well, that certainly sounds like slavery to me.
You know what? And it sounds like slavery to me, but it's not. What I'm talking about is a school or a reform school for children that is in Alabama. And I say is because it currently still exists. Now, it may not exist in the same way that it existed before. However, it's still in existence. What we're talking about is we're talking about the Alabama Industrial School for Negro Children. It's had several names. It was also called the Alabama Reform School for Juvenile Negro Lawbreakers. And so it's had several names. And before we get into our conversation, I want to just say a little bit about how it was founded, because I think this is really interesting. It was actually founded in 1908 by Cordelia Bowen, who was a child of a formerly enslaved person. And so Miss Bowen really noticed that there were lots of Black children who were getting into trouble, and they were sending these children to adult prisons. And so she decided that she wanted to do something, and so she actually started this school, or this reform school. And when it started, the intent was good. The intent was really to be a place of safety for Black children. It was supposed to be a place where they could learn skills, go to school, and really move out of that situation and become productive members of society.
So an
However,
actual reform.
exactly, an actual reform school. However, what it became was a new type of slavery for children.
Yes.
And it became a place of horror for a lot of children. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about this place. It's been called Mount Meigs. That's kind of what people call it. But it's a place where the original intent, it started off in a good intent in a good way, but then it evolved into something that really helped to maintain racial segregation and discrimination, and was really extremely disruptive to the lives of children.
Yes. And the catalyst to why it became such a horrific place for these children was the founder. We were discussing this, and our conclusion is that she was having some financial or difficulty with continuing to fund the school, that she actually lobbied for the state of Alabama to take over this school for Black children who are, thought of as engaging in behavior that's not productive, right? And so, when I say you and I talked about it, was because one of the things that I questioned and what I was looking for in my research was why she thought it was beneficial for a state like Alabama
Yeah.
and in 1911 to take over this, reform school for Black children. Like, I just didn't understand why that would be um, something on her list, or what she or to think that that would be a good thing.
Right. To think that the state would be a good caretaker for
A
Black
steward.
children, just
Mhm.
knowing the, but also I think we have to remember that we're really talking about the time immediately post slavery, the Reconstruction. And
Mhm.
so some things that I read talked about Reconstruction being that time when certain people were allowed, um, to gain some power, and
Mhm.
this is before the backlash and Jim Crow and
Jim
everything.
Crow. So
But
it
it
was kind of
was,
like in between that
yeah, it was a
those two time frames.
yeah, and so maybe she was being a little bit too positive or a little bit too naive in thinking
Hmm.
about how the state was going to manage the children, because
Right.
what ended up happening is you ended up having this complex, or this or the system, and
Hmm.
around it you had the board members of the school, and they actually physically lived in their own houses with farms, and they were around the school, and the children actually tended the land of the board members. And this is where they work. So not only did they work in this reform
The
school, but
facility itself.
yeah,
Yeah.
in the facility, they worked on in other places. So this is very similar to at the time when they had a lot of the Black men who were in prison, who were actually being loaned out to places. And so it was kind of a parallel system with the children and with the adults.
Yeah.
And so the children, and they weren't paid for this.
Right.
They were out there working from sun up to sundown. One of the stories that I heard, and this was firsthand. When I say stories, I'm not talking about fiction. I'm talking about firsthand accounts. Uh, this man mentioned that before they would beat you, this man would the overseer would say, "Dig your hole." So the hole, and I'm thinking, are they going to kill this child and bury the child there? That's not what it was for. It was a hole so they could stick their genitalia in. The males could stick their genitalia in so they could lay on the ground, and their backs could be completely exposed so they could just be beaten,
Mhm.
beaten, beaten. And the person who said, he said he was beaten so badly he could not get up. He had to crawl. He could not physically get up to walk. He said that he saw many children beaten to within an inch of their lives.
Yeah. And a lot of children ended up dying.
Yeah, and he said
Most
children
of
would
them.
just disappear sometimes. They didn't even
Hmm.
know that the
Hmm.
children, whether they were dead or alive, they would just disappear, and no one would ever,
And
say anything.
I think this is interesting because of the atrocious history. Number one, I'm surprised that we haven't heard of this on a more massive scale. Obviously, that's what we're here for, to kind of root these things out and bring it to the attention of our listeners and our followers.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, the level of abuse that occurred, I'm just shocked that we don't really hear about this,
Right.
because, like you said, the school is still operating. So one of the things that happened, so that these children were sentenced to this reform school where there was no rehabilitation going on and there was no education going
Education
on.
going on.
So it
Yeah.
was not a
Yeah.
reform
It
school
was
at
just
all.
it was just free labor
It
for
was
the
a
people
slave
who ran
institution.
the school. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a slave institution. And and one of the probation officers, his last name was Abbott, Danny Abbott,
Yes.
Danny or Denny. Let me see. It is Denny. So Denny Abbott, he was a probation officer at the time for the family court in Montgomery.
Right.
And so he would sentence or send kids to this school. And then one day, 4 girls from the school who had escaped came to his office. And when he saw them, he was moved to take action.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so he did. So he took action. And one of the quotes, I went to I guess it's his website, and I want to find exactly what he said because it really moved me. Okay, hold
Yeah.
on. Let's see. Hold on.
And while you're finding that, one of the things that I
Okay.
heard, in listening to firsthand accounts, is that he grew up in a very, very, very racist home, and he said that the N word was mentioned. I mean, it was used like daily, and
Who did
so
he?
yeah. So this
Mhm.
so this person, had really, really been
Indoctrinated.
indoctrinated, and however, and you're gonna tell us the story about how he saw these
Stop.
4 girls who had
Mhm.
escaped and they'd been brought back, and he talked to them,
Mhm.
and then he was so moved
Yeah.
that he took action.
So he said, after I talked with those girls that day, I went home that night to my kids in a nice home with parents who loved them and protected them and cared about them. Those girls who were in my office, those could have been my kids. There is no difference. I firmly believe that if one truly loves his own children, then he has to be concerned about the welfare of other children. If he's not, then I think he does his own children a disservice.
Ooh, yeah.
And I just was like, wow. And this is, and he's a white man,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, the humanity overcame him,
Yeah.
right? Which is what we all want to happen, right? We're all humans, and we are all a part of that one race of humanity. And so he saw that. And so, he was like, and what was also important was like these young girls came into his office, and it was like you couldn't ignore it because the bruises were on them.
Right.
The fear was in their eyes.
The
So
brokenness.
the brokenness. So
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
couldn't turn his back on it. And so basically, he spearheaded a lawsuit. He ended up losing his job because of all of
Right.
it.
Right.
And
So he had he had a personal sacrifice that he had to make in order
yeah,
to make the situation better for others. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and he did that. And so this was in 1969. And this was the other thing too. He was like, this was the 1960s, but after learning what was going on at that facility, it might as well have been the 1860s.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was really no
There
difference,
wasn't a
which is why
distinction. Yeah.
at the top of our episode, what you described was slavery, and
Right.
that's what was
Right.
going on. This,
Right.
so yeah. So anyway, so he filed suit, and or he was a part of the movement to file suit in 1969, and so what had happened was what I found interesting was all that they did. I mean, he made a big sacrifice, most definitely, but all the court did was they were forced. The state was forced to investigate those claims, and they began cleaning up the facility within months of the lawsuit. State officials ended the farm program. Okay.
Program. Oh, okay.
Right. And then hired an educated and trained staff and added real vocational programs and set strict guidelines for corporal punishment. And then it was also desegregated.
Mm-hmm.
So that desegregation was a part of that as well. It's kind of like it's a little bit separate, but not really.
Right. Right.
Because one of the issues is they had schools like that for white children,
Exactly. But they were
but
different.
they were different. And
They
yeah,
provided services. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that was part of the legal strategy is the desegregation. And
Yeah.
so that's what happened. But when you talk about the people who went to that school, they were never compensated for their pain and their injuries.
Well, some of them can't be because they're dead, you know?
Well,
And their
yeah.
families have not been compensated. Some of their, I'm pretty sure that, like, if there were people who were deemed runaways, and because there were children who were there because they did not have family that could take care of them. So
Mhm.
some of their family members, they may not even know what happened to their children.
And that was the other key point in this reform school, and I'm gonna keep doing that. Is that or this I should call it the slave
Slave
complex.
camp.
Yeah, the slave camp.
The slave camp.
Yeah. And so a lot of the children had not really committed any crimes. Like you
Right.
said,
Right.
it was that situation where children just didn't have parents, right?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
parents to take care of them. And a lot of them would have to go there because they were lazy or
Yeah.
incorrigible, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And then other, very trivial things like theft and things like that. But, they would pay for it with their lives for extended periods of time,
Right.
of getting abused and not getting. And the end result was those that did survive, most of them ended up in a life of crime
Yes.
afterwards because there was no rehabilitation. There was none of
You
that
know,
going on.
and I definitely want us to spend a second to talk about this because, when I think about the biopsychosocial spiritual piece of this whole situation, and we think about what was done to children. So children, and some of these children had not committed any crimes. And some of the things that they were there for were just normal childhood things, you know?
Yeah.
And so what happens to a child when you put them in a situation that is really horrific, that you show them that adults don't care, um you and you give them an opportunity to lash out at other children. So what ended up happening is this place, not only were children abused by the the overseer, because that's what the person was called,
Hmm.
they also abused each other. And
Hmm.
so when we think about what happens to people when they are put into situations where they don't receive any type of rehabilitation, where their mental health is compromised, and then you have these overseers that are encouraging, because what they did is they encouraged the older children to um, put the younger children in their place so
Hmm.
they could establish this hierarchy, and the overseers could use the older children as surrogate I guess jailers, if that
Hmm.
makes sense. And so very very lots of parallels to slavery. And
Yeah.
so some children they gave a little bit of privilege to, and with that privilege the expectation was that they would then go and inflict harm on younger children. So sexual abuse was rampant throughout the facility.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that the people who did the firsthand account stories spoke about: the sexual abuse, the beatings, the intimidation, from older children and from guards, and just how horrific it was. So as a result of that, so many of those children became hardened criminals.
Hmm.
And when I say hardened criminals, I mean people without empathy, because that's what happened. The empathy, the ability to regulate their emotions, those things were beaten out of these children.
Yeah. Hmm.
And I even read one case where a man brutally, after he left this facility, he brutally murdered 3 people.
Hmm.
And he was in a place where he could have gotten the death penalty. However, he did not get the death penalty because his lawyer brought up the conditions that he
Yeah.
experienced in this place. And as a result, they did not give this black man who had killed 3 people, they did not give him, and brutally killed 3 people, they did not give
Yeah.
him the death penalty because people understood the level of deprivation that he had experienced here in this
Yeah.
place.
Yeah. And the abuse and all that.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can't deny it. You can't. And especially when it's a child who's still growing and developing.
Right.
So you're teaching this child to behave in this way, basically. You know.
Adults
Mhm.
who were supposed to be guiding and managing children and helping them develop skills for life, they were the ones inflicting this. So what does that say? Who do you become when the people who are shaping you in a way that's not whole? And I want to also mention that there were 2 people who left this facility, and actually became very, very famous. One of them was Satchel Paige,
Yeah.
the
Now Satchel
baseball
Paige.
player.
Let me ask you this though. So Satchel Paige, was he there while Bowen was
Yes,
still
he
the
was
owner?
there early.
Yeah.
So now he was really engaged in a lot of theft, and so he was sentenced to the facility until it turned 18. And from a lot of accounts, that really helped save his life.
Mm-hmm.
Because as a Black man in the South, engaging in all these crimes, people were really afraid that he was going to get killed.
Right, of
So
course.
it really saved his life, and he went on and became a very famous baseball player. But you're right. We wouldn't
Yeah,
make the distinction that he was there during the first part of it when um,
its
it was
mission
still, yeah,
was still the focus of
right,
the school.
right.
Yeah.
There was still the true
Hmm.
mission.
Yeah.
Now, Lonnie Holly is an artist who also
Hmm.
was in the facility. He was in this facility during the 1960s, and
Yes.
he experienced the horrific abuse, the deprivation, degradation.
Hmm.
Um, so he experienced this. And I went and I looked at his artwork because he does spoken word, he does poetry, he does artwork. I think he even did some music. I think
Yeah,
he,
I think I read
yeah.
that. Mhm. Yeah.
And so I went and I looked at his artwork, and I was truly moved by his sculptures because they really, his whole premise is you take everyday objects and you shape them into something to tell a story. And that's when you look at his work, there's one where it it symbolizes blood coming from a sculpture, and this is when he mentions how he was beaten so badly that blood was just dripping off of
Yeah.
him, you
Hmm.
know. So
Yeah.
he was able to find a way to transform that experience into something to show the world
Hmm. Yeah, he channeled
so they
it in
could
a
see
way.
it. Yeah, so they could
Mhm.
see the world through his eyes. However, not everyone was able to do that, and the way that they were able to survive um, was to really become hardened and to really,
Mhm.
to not show empathy. And so that led many, many people to be part of the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and that just goes to show how the school that the slave camp really wasn't there for purposes of rehabilitation
Right.
or educating anyone, because a vast
Exactly.
majority of them either ended up dead or they ended up in the criminal system as adults, which is
Right.
in total opposition of what the mission was and should have continued to be, which it wasn't.
And I think it was contrary to the original mission, but I think it was very consistent with the mission once the state took over.
Yeah.
Because think about it, they had a way to find any small reason to put Black children in this facility to beat the spirit down so that they became part of the criminal justice system in the future. And so it was just another form of slavery.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
was just that perpetuating that whole mentality, that whole part of slavery,
Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
even now, and two things. The first thing is, for people like Lonnie, is that his name? Lonnie,
yeah.
right? So
Lonnie
people like
Holly.
Lonnie Holly, yes. For people like Lonnie and others who did survive, that's what I'm saying. Those folks are entitled to compensation, for
Absolutely.
the abuse that they suffered. And I think that, you know, there are, we still have, treatment facilities. We still have boarding schools. We still have reformatory type schools now
Yeah.
for children. And they may not be at the level of the Alabama school for Negro children. It may not be to that extent now, but I'm sure that there are a lot of them that are still missing the mark, right? And one of the things that I saw was that there's lots of parallels to the current prison, industrial complex that we've got going on, and how our system is rooted in punishment and not really rehabilitation, and it
Right.
doesn't exclude children. So children, they just are in the same, they're just in jail with each other, right? Instead of being
Yeah.
in jail with adults. But is the real focus rehabilitation? And I would venture to say not like we would want to see it, because as a matter of fact, even now, in my research, I found that there was a boarding school in Utah that Paris Hilton went to, And she actually testified before the Utah legislature that she was abused at that school.
Yeah.
And one of the things is that there really isn't comprehensive and consistent legislation governing facilities that handle children who are deemed in some form or fashion to not engage in acceptable behavior. Right. So it can be, on the very simple nonviolent scale, all the way up to, the violent scale, right, of children's behavior being an aberration of what we think should be normal, or, of their behavior. And then sometimes kids are just sent away to these schools with the expectation from their parents that they are, that they are being taken care of. And in a lot of cases, they're not. Because there was another case, and I think it was in Utah as well. Yeah, and there was a little boy who was sent to to the same school, I believe, in Utah, and they would engage in these tactics that, in my mind are abusive. Like it was a 12-year-old boy, and they would put him in basically a solitary confinement for kids. Like he had to sit in the room and stare at a wall for 12 hours straight, and just engage in those kinds of behaviors. And and when his aunt discovered the type of treatment they were using in his case, she complained, obviously. And, it was discovered that there really isn't a lot there to protect children who are sentenced to these facilities. And there still isn't. I mean, when I didn't research in depth, but it's not very clear that there really is right now. Some states, but when you engage in legislation by state, it's going to be different.
Yeah,
and it varies. Enforcement varies. But so that's why we have the federal system as well, so that these kinds of situations are equalized, and behavior is what's the word? Behavior is affected on a more consistent basis.
Yeah, so you have the consistency in laws, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thinking about that. Yeah. And I also think that we have this undergirding thought that Black children are more dangerous than white children. And because of that, our laws reflect that, and we end up seeing more Black children put in, and the studies that have shown that when Black children commit a crime versus a white child that commits a crime, that the sentencing them is different. And more white children are more likely to go into the juvenile system and to actually be seen as needing rehabilitation, whereas Black children, when they commit the same crime, are seen as more hardened criminals, and so they feel like they can go into the adult system.
Yeah, they're certified as adults.
Yeah, so there's racism. It's coming up again. Racism is undergirding these assumptions, and we really need to rethink what we think about children and our knowledge about children. I mean, I think this is a great time for us to start to talk about the call to action. I think one of the pieces is for folks to really think about how are juveniles treated within their communities, and how are they monitored? Like when children are sent to certain places, what does your state do? What does your locality do? How do they monitor? How do they make sure that children are being taken care of? Because we know that if people aren't monitoring things, and that there could be some things occurring that may not be known. So just really being aware of that, and really making an effort to find out what your representatives, what your legislative representatives are, how they view crime and how they view juveniles and how they view rehabilitation
Mm-hmm.
versus punishment. I think that's really important.
Yeah. And I think as parents too, if for parents out there who have children who, may need assistance, whose children are exhibiting behaviors that, that are disruptive to their environments or whatever it is that is contradictory to what we deem as normal behavior, to be mindful of where and what resources are being presented to you for your child,
Yeah.
because you have to know that these institutions aren't highly regulated, in my opinion, and it depends on the state as well.
State. Yeah.
So you'd
Yeah.
have to, you'd have to be vigilant to check to see what regulations are there, how officials that work in those facilities, how they're vetted, how complaints are treated, how investigations are begun, when actions are deemed abusive to children that are attending those facilities. So just to be very vigilant in that, because there isn't this automatic thing that everybody is doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that there's this sort of regulatory body or anything that's making sure that these institutions engage in behavior that's acceptable. So
Yeah.
that would be my call to action as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think another thing is um, to really listen to the podcast. It's called Unreformed, and it really talks about this Alabama facility, and it really goes into depth, and you can hear some firsthand accounts. And it's really important to educate yourself, because if we don't understand what has happened, then we can't prevent it from happening again. And so, that old quote about those who don't take the time to learn about the past, you're doomed to repeat.
I think that can kind of take us to the tell me something good part, right? Because that we kind of started this episode off, or in the beginning part, and acknowledging the fact that this is a situation that we didn't know about, right?
Right.
So
right.
So we didn't know about it until you stumbled across this podcast. So to give the podcast.
Yes. And I want to give a shout out. I want to give a shout out to one of our listeners, Sharice from Virginia, who actually, when we were thinking about podcast topics, she actually said, hey, here's a little article that you should read. And I was so just taken by the fact that I had no idea. I'd never heard of this before. And how, this is what our podcast is about. It's about really helping folks to see things and explore things that aren't a part of their daily timeline.
Right.
Exactly. This is important.
Very important, because how many children were affected at this institution? And so the podcast that we're talking about is a podcast that was started by a journalist, and her name is Josie Duffy Rice. And she spent, I think I read, at least a year researching this school, and getting those firsthand accounts that you were referring to. The firsthand accounts are on her podcast, and it's an 8-part investigative series that's hosted by Josie Duffy Rice. So that's another thing. So that's a tell me something good, because we when we get the word out there, then we can begin the discussion of accountability and remuneration for the atrocities that were carried on by a body of the government,
Right.
a representation of our government. It was the state that was running this.
Tax dollars were used to enslave children.
Yeah.
And so when you start thinking about it in that way, then you start to see this differently, and you start to understand why this is important for all of us to know about.
Knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power.
That may
Knowledge is
seem,
power.
that may sound a little, what's the word?
Like cliche-ish.
Cliche. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
really, when you think about it, it really is true, because that's where movements start.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
all right. So I think that should wrap us up for this episode, Nikki. I think it was really good, very informative, and hopefully our listeners learned something new. We
Absolutely.
certainly did in preparing for this episode. So make sure you comment and like and subscribe
Like and
to hear
subscribe.
more of topics like this, so that we can continue to educate our communities, because we know, some of the powers that be are trying to prevent us from learning about
Absolutely.
history. So
Absolutely. And so I love that, Kimmy. That's a great way for us to end this episode. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power.
yep. All right.
right.
Until next time. Bye for now.
Bye.